Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. So if you're familiar with my videos, I love reading stories from paranormal websites, and I tend to file them under particular themes. For example, I've done backwards knees, on the ceiling, doppelgangers, goblins. Often, in addition to reading first-hand stories that fall under the chosen theme, I'll also go into relevant discussions of folklore and urban legends, science, psychology, all kinds of stuff. There's a theme I've been collecting quite a few stories for, but I don't have a ton of additional topics outside of the stories themselves to discuss. So tonight, we're just going to go through a bunch of stories. I have 11 stories for you, and the theme is vanishing houses, or phantom houses. Houses that don't appear upon a second visit or glance, or their appearance has changed. The stories we are going to be reading come from two of my favorite websites for first-hand paranormal experiences. The first one is called Your Ghost Stories, which I've been a reader of for a very long time, and the second one is called Liminal Earth, which I only discovered a few months ago, but I've really enjoyed it. Generally, I read the stories from these websites separately, meaning I will dedicate videos to either stories all from Your Ghost Stories, affectionately known as YGS, or stories all from Liminal Earth. I have playlists for both of those that you can find if you're interested, and I'll pin them at the end of the video. And I'll probably just throw this video onto both of those playlists when I'm done with it. The only difference between the two websites, as far as our reading experience will go, is that Your Ghost Stories has a comment section that can often be very interesting that I sometimes read from. And Liminal Earth has the actual location of the paranormal event pinned on Google Earth. So, if you are watching, during each reading from Liminal Earth, I'll be showing the actual location of the story, whereas during readings from Your Ghost Stories, I will be showing some sort of B-roll. If you're just listening though, none of that matters. Just thought I'd explain to you how it's gonna go down. If that all sounds good to you, let's get started. We'll kick things off with a very short story from Liminal Earth. It's called Hobbit Door in the Redwoods. This story takes place in Crescent City, California, around July 2015. My wife and I were driving out Redwood Highway for a trip to the Redwoods and the beach. Somewhere around where the road splits and heads either north towards Brookings or south towards Crescent City, right where the Redwoods start again, we passed a particular tree with a hobbit-like round green door in it. I was dumbfounded, but said nothing, as my experiences with high strangeness were a point of contention between my wife and I didn't want to trigger a fight. But about 90 seconds later, she goes, "Am I crazy, or did you see that too?" I asked if she had seen a green door in a tree, and she confirmed that she had. At that point, we swung back around and drove up and down that stretch of road, trying to find the door in the tree, to no avail. Since then, I have heard tales of a green door that appears and disappears, primarily around Catalina Island, which is several hours south of this location. That story was submitted by Zaruga, and I couldn't help but find it a little funny to think about their wife just being like, "I swear to God, if you bring up high strangeness again." She's just so sick of it. She's sick of his experiences with high strangeness. And look, they had one together. That's so romantic and sweet. That is pretty interesting. The redwood trees in themselves, I've never seen them in person, but they're supposed to be a marvel on their own, right? I think just being in a redwood forest would be a pretty mystical, magical experience, and then you see a little hobbit door. It reminds me of a couple things. One of them is that there's actually this place around where I live. It's kind of like a nature park. It's like a zoo, but it's pretty much a zoo. But there's like a little pond, lake sort of area. You can see it from the road, and if you visit, you take like a little tram from one area to the next. And on the other side of the water, it's like not accessible at all unless you were to use a boat. But right in the side of this hill, that's just like, there's the hillside and it goes into the water. There is a red, round Hobbit door. And I've been there countless times. Like, went there a lot as a kid. I still go sometimes as an adult. And they give you, when you take the tram, they like give you the history, the little lowdown of the place. Nobody has ever mentioned this door, this Hobbit door. And I have no idea what it's for, if there's any function to it, or if it's just decorative. It's very strange, but it's very cool. If I'm able to get a picture of it by the time I post this, I'll include it. But I'm not sure if I'll be able to. But it's fascinating. Next time I go, I'll have to just try and ask somebody, like, what the heck is that? Although I kind of don't want to destroy the mystery in that way. Or maybe it won't be there. Maybe it won't be there by the time I want to ask or take a picture. Another thing it reminds me of is a book. One of those oversized coffee table photography books. I don't know if those are still a popular thing. But I used to love, browsing them at Barnes & Noble. But my dad had one, and it was all photographies of trees. It's like walking with trees or something. And there was one picture of a tree with a door in it, which I thought was excellent when I was a kid. And I was like, oh, I want to live in a tree. What better place to live? Actually, there is a post on Liminal Earth where someone found a tree with a door in it. Let me pull that up real quick. Yeah, I think I was going to save this one for maybe another episode, but why not mention it now? It's called Tree Door / Portal. It was taken in Wales in 2019, May 26, 2019, and it says, a door in a tree. Didn't try and open it or knock. The residents probably get enough humans bothering them. It could also be a portal. And it almost takes you a second when you look at the photo to really see the door, but it's pretty incredible. I wonder if it actually functions. Like, I see the little hinges on there, but I don't know if they actually work. What would you do if you saw this? I think I'd have to try and open it. I totally understand where they were coming from, being respectful of the Fae, but how often do you come across that? I think I'd have to open it up and see what's inside. So at the end of that story, they mention, since seeing the green door, they have heard tales of a green door that appears and disappears primarily around Catalina Island. I did try and do a little research to find more about this, and the only thing I could find was a mere mention at the end of this article from the Catalina Insider from 2012, which says at the end, the article is called Land of the Giants, and I suppose it is, I'm not gonna lie to you, I didn't read the article, but I think it's about some kind of skeletal remains or something that are large, or might be from a giant. But the author, Jim Watson, says at the end of the article, maybe I probably shouldn't read this article because it talks about portals and it sounds pretty interesting. It says, if you remember my column from last Halloween, perhaps the mysterious green door that appears from time to time in Toyon Bay is one of these portals. So he wrote an article about the green door, but I couldn't find it. I went back in their archive. I went back to his name and looked through all his past posts, and they only go as far as 2012. They don't go to the previous year. So I couldn't find it, so that was upsetting. So if anyone knows anything about the Catalina green door that appears to disappear and appear in different locations, that sounds awesome. Please let us know. Now let's move on to a story from your ghost stories. This one was written by Drakester from Texas, and it's called Witch House. Back in 1994, I was working on a seismograph crew in north central Texas, about 30 miles northeast of Midland, Texas. The job would take us walking miles off-road along the countryside, laying out cables and equipment. One day doing this, we came across an abandoned farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere. The house was a one-story stucco with a long front porch and the windows gone. The house had several oak trees around it. In the oak trees hung small dried animal carcasses of reptiles and rodents that are found in the area. But the strangest thing were the paintings that covered the house. The paintings were graffiti of strange symbols and writings that I did not recognize or understand and never seen before. Even though we can see it's hollow indoors, none of us would dare go in. One of the workers had a camera and took a picture of the house. Shortly after that, I had left Texas and didn't see any of those workers for a couple of years and never really thought about that house. 2 years later, I was working in Gillette, Wyoming, when I met the worker that had taken the picture. After work, I went to visit him in his motel room. He took a bunch of pictures out of the work we did in Texas. At one point of going through the pictures, he asked if I remembered the old witch house we came across. I told him I did, and he pulled out the photo and showed it to me. I couldn't believe or understand what I saw. The house and trees were in the picture, but the strange paintings that covered the house were not there. All I saw was an old, tan, stucco house. So that house didn't vanish, but its appearance changed in the photograph. Like I mentioned earlier, I love reading the comments on this website because a lot of times people end up sharing a similar experience they had or some really interesting cultural information. This time, a couple people just chime in about some houses they remember that gave them the creeps. I'll read a couple for you. Commenter DC in AZ says, "Yeah, that does sound a bit freaky, especially for the fact that none of you wanted to go near it. There's a house in my neighborhood that is very strange in that same way. No one wants to go near it either. Even stranger than that is most of my neighbors, me included, often forget it's even there. I've lived in my home for nearly 20 years, and in all that time, no one has ever occupied that house. It's a mystery, really." Another commenter, Shinigami0, says, "I know what it's like to not want to step anywhere near a place. In my neighborhood, there's an empty cul-de-sac towards the back of the neighborhood, and for some reason, I get this horrible feeling when I get near it, and I'll refuse to walk down it. I don't know if something happened there, but I want nothing to do with that road." This is a pretty common experience, right? There's a spooky house in the neighborhood that for some reason just kind of gives you a weird vibe. The heebie-jeebies, maybe there's a weird, everyone, there's almost a little local folklore about it. You might call it the witch house or something. And maybe that's because the house is a little run down or because it's empty or maybe for no reason at all. There was a house like that in the neighborhood that I grew up in, and there wasn't really any reason, as in it wasn't run down, it wasn't abandoned, it was pretty much just like any other houses. And I even want to say that it was like a little tucked back and just like a little darker than all the other houses, but it really wasn't. It was right on the road, same distance from the other houses, same distance from the road as the others. It just kind of had like a heaviness and a darkness to it. And at one point, a couple lived there, and I remember thinking that they were vampires. I just thought they were vampires. Whenever I saw them, which wasn't very often, it was just whenever they went to their car, basically, they would always be wearing sunglasses, and they were like really pale, and no one ever talked to them, no one knew anything about them, which honestly, if I lived in a house in a neighborhood, that would probably be me. I don't know if I'd be the most social with my neighbors. Who knows, maybe. There was nothing that strange about him. I just created that in my head, I think. Maybe you guys have had that experience. I feel like the spooky house in the neighborhood, that's something a lot of people can relate to. That's some classic Goosebumps plotline material, right? So, in addition to there being first-hand accounts on Liminal Earth, people also will tag places and submit local folklore, and that is the case for this entry off the west coast of Ireland called High Brasil. I actually found this just by cruising around on the physical map. That's one of the ways you can navigate Liminal Earth. You can look up stories by theme. Love that. I did a video where we looked under the Thin Places tab. Or you can just scrub around on this map. So I was looking on the map and I noticed this little location tagged in the middle of the ocean. And it's categorized as high strangeness. And interestingly enough, I can only find this entry by zooming in on the map. Normally, if you click a story on the map, it will take you to a separate page to read the story, or you can search the title of the story and find it, but it doesn't work when you type High Brasil in the search bar. Nothing comes up, which is intriguing because High Brasil is a phantom island. So the post for it on Liminal Earth says, Hi Brasil, a mythical island off the coast of Ireland, said to be occupied by a warlock and his flock of enormous black rabbits. What? Okay, interesting, intriguing. So I had to look that up, of course. So the story with Hi Brasil is it's a phantom island that has been said to appear off of the coast of Ireland and even appeared on maps up until 1873. And it would be shown on the map as a small island, but no one has ever visited this island. It was probably placed on maps just because of rumors and folklore. It's said to be shrouded in mist or fog and invisible to the human eye, except for one day every 7 years when it's said to appear, but it's still not able to be visited. Let me read you this little excerpt from a book called Irish Wonders: The Ghosts, Giants, Pookas, Demons, Leprechauns, Banshees, Fairies, Witches, Widows, Old Maids, and Other Marvels of the Emerald Isle. Popular Tales as Told by the People. That's a very long title for a book, but a book I will be reading in the future, for sure. So, they have a chapter on Hi Brasil, which is called The Enchanted Island, and it says, In the afternoon of Sunday, July 7th, 1878, the inhabitants of Ballycotton, County Cork, were greatly excited by the sudden appearance, far out at sea, of an island where none was known to exist. The men of the town and island of Ballycotton were fishermen, and knew the sea as well as they knew the land. The day before, they had been out in their boats and sailed over the spot where the strange island now appeared, and were certain that the locality was the best fishing ground they had. And still they gazed, and still the wonder grew. For the day was clear, and the island could be seen as plainly as they saw the hills to the north. It was rugged, in some parts rocky, in others densely wooded. Here and there were deep shadows in the sides, indicating glens heavily covered with undergrowth and grasses. At one end it rose almost precipitously from the sea, and the other, the declivity was gradual. The thick forest of the mountainous portion gave way to smaller trees, those to shrubs, these to green meadows, that finally melted into the sea and became indistinguishable from the waves. So, people have said that they could see it very clearly. However, under sail and oar, 100 boats put off from the shore to investigate, when, as they neared the spot, the strange island became dim in outline, less vivid in color, and at last vanished entirely, leaving the wonder-stricken villagers to return, fully convinced that for the first time in their lives they had really seen the enchanted island. So, Hi Brasil had been a legend for about 400 years, leading up to this alleged sighting in 1878. So people have allegedly seen the island and searched for the island, but can't access the island. So as far as the post on Liminal Earth that mentions the magician and enormous black rabbits, there is a mention of that on the Wikipedia page that says, in 1674, a Captain John Nisbet claimed to have seen the island when on a journey from France to Ireland, stating that the island was inhabited by large black rabbits and a magician who lived alone in a stone castle. Now that's awesome, right? That's a great story, but unfortunately, it is just a story. And it was a story written by an Irish author named Richard Head, and I can neither confirm or deny whether Hi Brasil is in fact real or fake. That's for those who have seen it to decide. And if the day indeed is July 7th, when it appears, and there was a sighting in 1878. It seems that the next appearance of Hi Brasil will be in 2025, so mark your calendars if you live in Ireland. Okay, now let's read an actual paranormal experience from Liminal Earth. This one is called Vanishing Elf Shack. It's very short. It took place in Seguin, Texas, in autumn of 1989. One day in 1989, my mother and I were driving down a country road when we saw a rustic shack with a sign saying open. We went inside and found it filled with intricate figurines in the shape of elves and fairies. We looked around for the shopkeeper, but found no one at all, nor any sign of human habitation. We were so curious that we decided to come back when someone was in, but when we returned the next week, the building was not where we remembered it to be, and we were never able to find it again. I think that story is so cute. The next one is going to be from Your Ghost Stories. It takes place in Ireland, and it's written by Aussie Red Dog. It's called The Vanishing House of Windy Willows. Isn't that a fabulous name for a story? This is not my story, but one of my brother's experiences. It has to be one of the strangest stories that stuck in my mind for years. I'm not revealing my brother's real name, so we'll just call him George and my other brother Ed. It was the summer of 1965. Every summer, George and Ed would hitch from the north of Ireland to the Republic of Ireland to go and see aunts and relations that were residing in the south. George and Ed were hitching their way down to the south and would stop at different houses, ask for directions to so-and-so, maybe get a glass of lemonade or maybe a sandwich. So, it was George's turn to ask for directions when they came to this long, winding driveway. Ed stayed at the bottom, sitting on the old stone wall, while George walked up the driveway. It was a warm summer day, maybe a few clouds skirting the pale blue Irish sky, when he came to a farmhouse. It was your typical Irish farmhouse, painted white with faded blue windowsills, a thatched roof, and a barn attached to the rear of the farmhouse. But the strangest thing was that there were cats. Cats of all different shapes and sizes and colors, all meowing. He couldn't believe it as he walked across the cobblestone courtyard. They were in their millions, rubbing against him, purring, meowing as he pushed through the crowd. Then he went up to the front door and knocked on it. No answer. He tried again, this time louder, and still no answer. Once more, and still no answer. The cats were all getting in closer by this stage, hanging off of the roof, coming out of the barn, crossing the courtyard towards George. He walked to the big bay window and looked in and got the biggest fright of his life. There, sitting in a circle, were 13 cats, all looking down in a hole. Then they all looked up at him and grinned. George screamed and ran for Ed to come and have a look at this, but Ed was already halfway down the road, screaming himself. Afterwards, he came home and my late granny called him into the kitchen. Somehow, she had got the wind of what happened and listened to his story. When he finished, she told him that the house was infamous. It was known as the Vanishing House of Windy Willows, and it only appears every 50 years. He went back with a few mates a few weeks later, and there was no sign of the house. So did I. I got the directions from him when I was there in '94 and went in search of the place. I couldn't find it. I would have to go back in 2015, 50 years to the day, and see if the house reappears. Well, Ireland seems to have a thing for vanishing places, right? And places that only appear every certain amount of years. First of all, I want to mention that the author of this story, Aussie Red Dog, is prolific on this website and has a ton of great stories on his account. There are some comments that he responds to. Someone commented and said, a bit unusual for George to look through a window and see well enough to count 13 cats. He also says that he bets Aussie Red Dog's granny has a dozen more stories like this, and I would have to agree. I wish Granny Aussie Red Dog had her own account on here. Aussie Red Dog responds to this and said, that's what he told me. He saw 13 cats sitting around a hole. Funny enough, I asked the same question and got a clip around the ear for being cheeky. So George insists it was 13 cats. He was able to count them real quick. Another person comments, could you tell us what significance the 13 cats looking into the hole is? What is the background on the house? Why does it appear every 50 years? For how long does it stay? Why all the cats? I have lots of questions. And Aussie Red Dog kindly responds, I'm not sure what the cats were looking down at and why there were 13 of them. My brother didn't stick around long enough to find out. Why does it appear every 50 years? Wish I could help you there. It was well known throughout the district and the locals avoided it as well. The house, according to my late granny, would only stay for a day, maybe 2, but no one knows why the house only appears every 50 years. So I told you that Aussie Red Dog has a ton of stories on this website. Well, he has another vanishing house story. This one takes place in Australia. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he's originally from Ireland, but also spent a lot of time living in Australia, possibly growing up there. Anyway, this story is called The Little Old Church in the Bush. The story I'm about to tell happened during the lockdown of 21. Though I wasn't meant to go more than 5 kilometers from where I live, I thought screw that and jumped into my old 78 Holden Kingswood. Threw in my swag, esky, and borrowed my best friend's little Jack Russell for company. The weather wasn't hot. In fact, it was raining, but I was bored. Threw the dog in, and off I went. I stopped here and there, either to take photos of the landscape or of old abandoned farmhouses that dotted the area. It was getting on near dark, and I needed somewhere to camp for the night. I found a dirt road and decided to follow it, see where it ends, and maybe set up camp. That road went on forever, over small causeways, through small patches of forest, until I reached near the end of the road where the dog and I discovered an old church. I was surprised by this, as it was about the last thing I expected. I had no idea what religion the church was. All it was this little church out in the middle of nowhere. Something about it bothered me. What, I don't recall. I got out with the dog and we both explored it. It was, of course, run down, oddly smelt of burnt wood, but yet I couldn't see any burnt wood. I don't think it had seen mass for a hell of a long time, as the windows were broken, some of the wood was rotted, and the roof was rusting. The dog and I found a way in through the old vestry. The church still had pews, and the pulpit where the vicar or priest gets up and speaks. I even found a tattered Bible, which I left as it was already eaten by mice and rats. The dog was getting nervous about something. He kept pushing himself into me as if saying, "Can we get out of here?" So I took the hint and left. But I took one look around and suddenly felt unseen eyes watching me. That creeped me out, so I quickly hurried out, with the dog pushing his way before me. Camp was set up, food was ready. The dog was a bit nervous about something, but he enjoyed his chicken necks and was munching on a bone. I was rolling myself a smoke when we both heard what sounded like singing. Children singing, but out of key, coming from the old church. I have no idea what the song was, but it was weird. The dog started growling as the singing got louder. There was even an organ playing, but yet there was none in the church. I looked at the beer I was drinking and was tempted to tip it out. Then it all went quiet. The rain eased off ages ago, so I sat there in my canopy of a tarp over the car and tent attached. It was silent. Then they started to sing again. I thought I heard the panicking voice of a man. I should have went and explored, but no bloody way was I leaving the campsite. This time the singing stopped and didn't return. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning dawned gray and wet. I already had the Kingswood packed when the dog needed to do his business, so I followed him on a bit of a walk when we came to a graveyard with old headstones leaning over. Most headstones were dated back to the 1920s, and it hadn't seen a burial since then. I walked through and noticed that each headstone was dedicated to a child. Another thing about the headstones was that each child died on the exact same day. Then I started to hear the singing again. I was out of there. So was the dog. I found out a bit later that a church dated back to the 1920s was destroyed by bushfire. Inside the church, a Sunday school was happening. No one survived. Here's the catch. I went back there about 3 weeks back, and there was no sign of the church. The graveyard was still there, but most of the headstones were worn away and hard to read. It was the same road that the dog and I took. I'm still bemused. I suppose churches are prone to vanishing because I have another one for you, this time from Liminal Earth, called The Church in the Woods. This one takes place in Nova Scotia around 2008, and it said, "As a child, I would bike down to the beach a lot, usually with friends. As I got older, I'd go by myself further down the road, just to get out of the house and be alone. It was around this time that I started biking by the church. It was old, dark, and almost completely hidden by the trees, but if I biked by at night, the windows would always be lit. One evening, I went out to bike, feeling angry and tired and frustrated, and I drove down the shore road. When I passed the church, I could see the door was open, and there was a figure standing there, completely silhouetted by the light coming from within. I felt almost compelled to enter. I remember getting off my bike and starting to walk up. The rest is a blur. I don't know if I entered the church, but I feel like if I had, I wouldn't be telling the story. I know I made it home before midnight, and I stopped biking down the shore road after that. Last year, I asked my mom about the church. She doesn't remember ever seeing it." So I've exhausted all the stories from Liminal Earth and your ghost stories, but I did stumble across a little bit of urban legend regarding a vanishing house. It's from Chicago, and it's called The Vanishing House of Bachelor's Grove. This appears to be a cemetery tucked away in a fairly wooden area and has some pretty old graves from the 1800s. It has become pretty popular since the 1970s for being potentially haunted, so it gets a lot of visits from ghost hunters and legend trippers and people just coming to hang out and party. So I found a little bit, just a very little bit about this legend. Some of it is, or most of it, from this website called Mysterious Chicago, and here's how they relay the ghost story. It says, "Many people walking through the woods to Bachelor's Grove Cemetery have reported seeing a house out in the woods. They never agree on where the house is in relation to the cemetery exactly, but they all describe it the same way. A white, 2-story Victorian farmhouse with a soft light glowing from the inside. Some say it gets smaller or further away as you walk closer to it. Some others say that if you go inside, you never come back out. When you come back out from the cemetery, the house will have disappeared, and there is no record of any house ever having been nearby." Now they go ahead and say that that's not true, that about no house ever having been nearby. There have been houses there in the past, and there are foundations for houses in the woods, but no actual houses do stand at this time. Just like the last story we read, there's the soft light glowing from inside. I see that as, well, one, a sign of it being inhabited, but also kind of a draw to compel you to come inside, like in the last story, right? Kind of like a fairy tale house in the woods. You see the lights are on, why not go inside? And actually, the only other mention that I could find on the internet to this legend was an Instagram post from someone called Greg Ludwig. His Instagram name is Ghost Inspector Greg. And the only thing his post adds is that in the 1980s, a boy reported going into the house and having cookies with a nice old lady. He entered in the early afternoon, stayed for 15 minutes, but when he came out, it was dark. The very next week, he went missing and was never found. All he remembered from his visit was that the lady was nice and the cookies were delicious. Now, there's no context or anything to back up that story, but it is a fun story. Again, very fairy tale-like in nature. And to me, that it's a house in a cemetery in the woods, bonus points. Bonus cool points on the story. Okay, so wow. Correction. Hold up. We're not moving on yet. While at first I couldn't find nearly any information about this topic besides what I just shared with you, I thought I'd reach out to one of the hosts of a podcast I really enjoy called Homespun Haints. This podcast is hosted by two women named Becky and Diana, and they bring on guests to share their own paranormal experiences. They also do episodes covering folklore and urban legends and topics that really aren't that different than what I discuss in my videos, except they've been doing it much longer than I have. I recalled that one of the hosts, Becky, had mentioned living in Chicago, so I thought I would take a chance and send them an email and see if they could help me with any information on the vanishing house of Bachelor's Grove. And lucky for me, she not only responded, but sent me a ton of information. They actually did an episode themselves on different legends of Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, which I highly recommend listening to if you're interested. So let me go over some of what Becky sent me in regards to the Phantom House. I won't be going over all of it. As I said, there is a wealth of information, but I will be including a link in the description to their website with this info and the episode they did. It will also be in my source list, which, if you didn't know, I always include a link to in my video descriptions, and I often put links to additional topics that I don't get around to including in my video. First off, let me read this document by Pete Crapia, the founder of the Bachelor's Grove Cemetery and Settlement Research Center. So it's also known as the Phantom Farmhouse and the Magic House. The legend of the disappearing house is the most popular story told. The most common description is a small white two-story house with a porch. It also has been described as 1850s to 1890s vintage and Victorian style. Other common descriptions include a light shining through the window on the second floor, a swing hanging over the porch, wooden pillars near the porch, as well as a small picket fence close by. Initial sightings of the house are likely to have originated as far back as the mid-1950s, with early 1960s reports being prevalent. The nature of why it is called the disappearing house has variations. One common report is that the house, which usually appears very solid and real, is visible on one visit, but upon follow-up visits, it is nowhere to be found. In other accounts, witnesses experience a transparent-like image of the house. This can vary from the entire house looking transparent to one of the windows appearing odd in some fashion. The light which emanates from the window has said to flicker like a flame, while giving off a yellow-orange color. Becky also mentioned to me that some people tell of a blue light coming from the ground level window. Like I mentioned earlier, I just love that detail of the story, of the lights in the windows of the house. Whether it's a blue light or a flickering candlelight, that just really appeals to me. It's like a creepy fairy tale, a la Shirley Jackson. So witnesses have reported this house being in various different locations around the cemetery. And according to the document, within the 2000 book Beyond the Grave, it mentions the author, Dale Kosmarek, as having interviewed dozens of individuals that have witnessed paranormal activity at the cemetery. And they made a map out of all the different experiences people have had. So that's pretty cool, although none of the maps have ever been made available for viewing to the general public. Alright, let me read some more. During a 1987 WLS television broadcast, Ted Visnek of Illinois spoke of his own experience with a farm-style house. During the broadcast, Visnek stated, "It had to be about 1973 when we saw it. We were walking off there with me and some of my friends, and we saw the house. It was during the day, which was kind of strange, because you'd think you'd see it, at nighttime or something. As they approached the area between the creek and the western side of the fence to the cemetery, there was an old house in front of them, with a light shining through the window. They stated it did not appear to be lit by electricity, but by some kind of flickering flame. As they walked toward it, each of them felt that the house was like a mirage. It was as if the closer they got to it, the farther it appeared to them. The girls eventually left the area out of fear and headed directly to the police station. After telling police what they saw, officers instructed them to sketch the house on paper. All three drew the same description, and it is also said that other witnesses had come forward in the past, sketching the same image. Whatever may have happened to these sketches is unknown. So those people felt so compelled that they went to the police station. Here's another one. In July of 1976, three brothers decided to stop by the cemetery while on their way to a carnival. During their visit, one of them made a comment about getting a sandwich from a house nearby. As two of the brothers looked in the direction of where it was located, one of them stated, "I didn't see that house when we came in. Maybe it's the caretaker's house?" All of them continued to walk around the area, and upon leaving at 8:30 p.m., they noticed that the house was no longer there. It was not until October of that same year when they learned about reports of a disappearing house near the cemetery. There was no indication as to the exact location where the house was sighted, but it was described as a small white house with a golden light coming from two windows. Wow, so they actually got a sandwich from the house. It's like the cookies of the little boy from earlier. That's pretty interesting, getting some physical food from the phantom house. So they're nice. They're nice people inside. Although, in fairy tales, it is number one rule not to eat anything you're given in strange places you visit, as it could be enchanted. Okay, let me read one more experience from this document. While as a guest on a 1982 WBBM radio broadcast in Chicago, Dale Kaczmarek, the author of the book they mentioned earlier, spoke of a woman that had brought a group of children to the cemetery. In 1965, they were all visiting the area due to hearing that, quote, some strange things happened back there, but did not know there was a cemetery. Kaczmarek then added, quote, they saw this house off to the right, about 60 to 70 yards away. He described the sighting as a big farmhouse, where it began to get smaller and smaller, as if shrinking, and it went farther and farther away. He described all of them watching the house as it began to shrink in size until disappearing. This house is a super cool story. I love it. And like I said, there's a ton of information. This whole document, it's about 6 pages to read. There's that. There's the podcast episode from Homespun Hates to listen to, and also Becky informed me of the Bachelor's Grove YouTube channel, which is made by one of the cemetery's groundskeepers who talks to people about their experiences in the cemetery as well as history and other interesting information. I'll leave a link to that in my source list as well, but wow. And there's also books. It's in books too, so there's a ton that I could go into. I'll leave it at that, and if there's more research you want to do on your own, I will provide the links. Thank you once again so much to Becky and Homespun Hates. I mean, seriously, thank you. Do go check them out if you enjoy paranormal podcasts, which I'm inclined to believe you do. So the last 2 stories I want to read are actually from Reddit, specifically the subreddit Glitch in the Matrix. The reason I didn't mention this in my intro is because I had no idea I would be reading these stories. I hadn't even found them yet at that point. Originally, it was going to be an additional story from both YGS and Liminal Earth, but one of them I decided wasn't strong enough, and the other one I came to find out was fabricated. I like to find stories that I believe to be genuine and credible. There's no way to know for sure, of course, but I do my best to get a sense of it through the nature of the narrative and the engagement in the comments. The story in question was from YGS, and I really, really liked the story and found that the author had posted a part 2 to their story. After reading that, it was clear that the story was made up, and the commenters under the story agreed, and the author was all but condemned. It's taken quite seriously on that website because they are trying to create a place where people can feel comfortable and validated in sharing their real experiences with the paranormal. Anyway, I've never been one to use Reddit. It's a pretty foreign place to me, but after some research I had been doing for an upcoming project, I got the idea to search there to maybe find replacements for the 2 stories I decided to cut from this episode. And that I did. So, let's start with this first story from the Glitch in the Matrix subreddit. It's posted by user Savage Lion Fox, and it's called Vanishing House That's Not Even a House Yet. So this happened back when I was in my first year of college. My friends and I decided to join this short film contest. We came up with a cool but overused horror story about some lady ghost who was out for blood. We were figuring out some places where we could shoot the film when my other friend thought of a place. It was on a hill with a few houses. Not creepy enough. It was for us to do a forest chase scene. So one down, one more to go. We needed a creepy house. We decided just to shoot the forest chase scenes and move on to another location that had a creepy house. We went to the place, and to our surprise, there was a creepy-looking house right in the middle of a group of trees. It was being constructed, but the way that it looked was very eerie, like it was being built to look like that. We asked the owner of the house, who was incidentally also there supervising the construction, if we could use some rooms for our shoot for a few days. He was so excited because he thought we were big-shot indie filmmakers, and so he said yes. He even fast-tracked the installation of his bathroom, just so we could film a bathroom mirror scene. I told you we were filming a cliched horror story. We filmed all the scenes and wrapped after a week. We thanked the guy for letting us shoot, and he even asked for a copy of the film when it was done. Days passed, editing, re-editing, and we finally submitted our short film entry. I almost forgot about the guy when my friend reminded us of him, so we all went back to his house. When we reached the place, it was empty, like nothing was even there. There were no signs of any construction or a house, just a plain piece of land in the middle of trees. I thought we were in another place, but my friends were all so sure that this is where we shot the film. The house was right in front of our forest chase scene, but it wasn't there. We decided to come back tomorrow. The next day, we all made it back to the house. It was there. The same creepy-looking house was there all along. We dropped the DVD off to the guy, and he was so happy. We didn't even bother telling him about the previous day's events. So I thought that was an interesting story on its own, but then I got into the comments, and someone writes this. Astral Rocker 2001 writes, "This happens. Cynthia Sue Larson has a website called Reality Shifters that talks about these experiences. Old barns that suddenly appear next door. Houses that appear for a few days and then disappear. And old rusty-covered bus stops that suddenly appears in front of a few houses, and no one knows why it is even there or where it came from." So when I read that, I had to look this up, whatever they're talking about. And I did find Miss Cynthia's website, Reality Shifters. We will come back to that, but I also found her book, which explains her concepts of reality shifts. And I thought it was interesting and relevant to what we're talking about, so let me read it for you. Okay, so this is actually a quote or a review or something from Fred Allen Wolf, PhD, National Book Award-winning author of Taking the Quantum Leap and many other books, including Dr. Quantum's Little Book of Big Ideas and The Yoga of Time Travel. He says, quote, "Ever wonder where that missing sock went when you last searched the clothes dryer? Thought about why those keys you so carefully tucked into your jacket pocket suddenly disappeared, only to be found underneath the cushion of your favorite television sofa?" I love my favorite television sofa. If so, then you have experienced what Cynthia Larson calls a reality shift. In her book, she explains in clear and unambiguous language just what these reality shifts are, why they occur, and how they can be used to influence and change your life for the better. So, this book is filled with people's experiences of these reality shifts, which maybe that's a possible explanation for these vanishing houses here, but it's kind of interesting how that tied into our theme. I browsed through the book, but I couldn't find any stories about vanishing houses. There's plenty of other vanishing and reappearing things, though. Objects, people. Her website, too, has a section where she has published people's experiences with reality shifts. I did find one pretty interesting account, as well as the barn story that the commenter on Reddit mentioned that led me down this rabbit hole in the first place. I can't complain. I love a good rabbit hole. I had a great time looking into everything in this episode, and the weirder the better, honestly, for me. So here's the barn post. It's called Aluminum Barn Suddenly Appears, posted by Randy from San Bernardino, California. "I think I came across a reality shift. A big aluminum barn-like structure appeared just at the mouth of a country road. It wasn't there, and then suddenly it was. I wasn't in the habit of driving through the space it occupied, but I cannot recall seeing it, but friends can. When I first saw it, it seemed so strange, but after hearing a friend say that it's been there since they moved in a few months ago, it seems the memory is coming to me. That it is, after all, so reasonable, easy to accept. But on the other hand, I would have recognized it because the way I see all the other houses is changed. The way the shadows play on them is different. This could have been a perceptual lapse, but if it is, it seems almost as strange. Why drive by something so huge and so singular, the only structure on one side of a country road, and not notice it? It provides shade in the heat, and it's also ugly. Oddly enough, I'm currently reading the book The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is not so different from this concept, and it was written in the 70s, so, maybe they drew inspiration. Cynthia drew inspiration from that book, but it's about a man who has dreams. He has certain dreams that after he dreams them, changes reality in waking life. So, for example, he has a dream that his aunt dies in a car crash, and when he wakes up from his dream, reality has just changed. That 6 months ago or 6 weeks ago, she had died in a car crash, and upon him waking, that's just the accepted reality of everyone. He can remember both realities, but everyone else, reality has just changed. It's such a good book. It's really good. Anyway, so here's the other story I found on the Reality Shifters website. It's about a phantom town. It's called Mysterious Town Appears by Colleen from Omaha, Nebraska. For various reasons, I don't believe that reality is stationary. I once came across a town in Colorado that didn't exist. I was southwest of Denver on Highway 285, an area I've been very familiar with my whole life, when on one occasion, my then husband, myself, and my 2 daughters came upon a town that didn't belong there, but there it was. I was astonished to see an entire functioning town that I had never seen before, with people, houses, and cars. I saw no school, but there was a post office. We noticed a couple of interesting shops, so we stopped and walked around. We had ice cream, and sat wondering where on earth we were. I don't recall the name of the town now, but at the time I went so far as to write it down. Later, when I checked on a better map than the one we had in the car, I confirmed that the town did not exist. And let's not forget that this is a part of the state that I knew like the back of my hand for 20 years prior to this. To say this was interesting is an understatement. Of course, on other trips through the area, the town was not there. It could be said that when we discovered the town wasn't there, we had taken a wrong turn. This explanation is just not a possibility. I know that enough things like this can happen, but this was not one of those times. Before I take you any further down the rabbit hole, let me read the final story of the night. Again, this is from the Glitch in the Matrix subreddit. It's by user BGLivingGood, and it's called The Vanishing House. My grandparents used to own some property in the mountains of Virginia, just outside of a little town called Hillsville. The property was somewhat secluded, off of a little dirt road called Pilgrim's Trail. They had a log cabin and several acres down in a valley, with only one neighbor up on one of the surrounding hills. No one else lived within about a mile. When I was in high school, my friends and I took weekend trips up there pretty frequently. We would hike nearby trails, fish for trout in the streams on the property, build campfires at night, and just hang out and goof off. One night, I was around the fire with 6 of my friends, and we started telling ghost stories. The subject made me think about some mildly creepy stuff that was just up the road. If you drove a couple of miles to the end of Pilgrim Trail and took a left onto the main road, the next left was Route 666. I made a mention of it to my friends, and they got all hyped up about the creepy aspect of it. The landscape there is littered with old abandoned farmhouses. I had driven Route 666 before out of curiosity, and knew that there were several along the road, so I suggested to my friends that we go and explore them the next day. I know it wasn't the safest idea, but hey, I was 17 and there were girls there. So the next morning we all piled into my buddy Travis's truck and drove out to Route 666. We ended up exploring 3 old houses on the road. We weren't too worried about people seeing us because only a couple of people lived on the entire road, and there's pretty much no traffic at all. The first house was empty and uneventful. The second was still furnished, but everything was trashed, and the only interesting thing we found were some old books. The third house was where things got interesting. It was a 2-story white farmhouse that was nestled in a large patch of woods. Most of the road has pasture on either side, so the fact that it was a wooded area right next to the road stood out. The other thing I noted was that the house sat on a very sharp bend in the road. There are no other turns on the road that are quite that sharp. Part of the house looked like it had caught fire at some point, but the main portion of it looked like it was still stable. We're standing outside of the house discussing whether or not it was safe to go in, and I guess we didn't realize that we were missing a member of the group. My friend Jordan, the most adventurous of us, suddenly poked his head out of the second story above us and yelled, "Hey guys, you need to come look at this." So naturally, we threw caution to the wind and went inside. I remember the entire first floor looking burned. The structure was exposed and blackened. Thankfully, the area where the stairs were was in better shape. Not burnt, just old and rickety. I remember as I climbed them, I was nervous. At the top of the stairs to the left, there was a hallway, but most of its floor was missing. To the right was the room where Jordan was still standing. I was not sure what I was looking at when I first walked in. The walls, the floor, and the ceiling were all painted white. The paint was not chipped and didn't really look weathered at all, except for the markings. Everywhere there were markings. Some looked carved with a knife, while others were scribbled with marker. Sketches of demonic-looking creatures, and scribbled poetry about gore and death. We figured local kids did it, but that didn't stop us from reading the scribblings out loud to each other. That lasted a couple of minutes. It was abruptly stopped by a loud bang that shook the house. We all froze. It sounded like it came from the other end of the decrepit old hallway. For a moment you could hear nothing but the wind in the trees outside. Then there was footsteps. I was looking right out the doorway and down the hall, and there was no one there. The sound grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable, heavy footsteps. As the sound grew nearer, I was able to place them better. They came from above the hallway. There was no third floor, but I assumed there was an attic. Regardless, that is where the sound was coming from. Before the sound had made it to the area above the doorway, I heard Travis say behind us, "We need to get the fuck out of here." No one argued. I think I took those old steps 4 at a time on the way down. We just got the hell out of there. Fast forward to about 2 months later. Much conversation and speculation had taken place regarding our creepy experience. We had told our other friends back home. Everyone was still generally creeped out. Regardless, I wasn't going to stop going up to the cabin. I loved that place and still do. It had a few miles between it and the creepy house, so we were able to put the experience somewhat out of our minds and resume our normal, once-in-a-while, weekend trips. The first trip back is when the glitch occurred. This time, there were 4 of us, including myself. With me was Travis and Daniel, who had been there for the house exploration, and Jason, who had not. Jason had heard the story and wanted to see the house. So, in broad daylight, we returned to Route 666. We told him we would drive him by the house. We had no intention of going inside, or even stopping for that matter. Route 666 is only a few miles long, so it only took a couple of minutes to get to the spot where the house was. But when we came to the sharp curve in the road, we were confused. There was no house, no wooded area, only a fence and a pasture with cows, just like the rest of the road. This must have not been the right spot. We continued driving. To our dismay, we found nothing. We drove that road end to end 4 times, thinking all the while that we were going crazy. Jason never accused us of lying. I guess he could sense the legitimacy of our confusion. There was no other sharp curve, so we parked for a moment at the only one. Daniel, Travis, and I agreed that it had to be the right spot. But how? There was no house. There were no woods. There was no sign of removal. The grass was green and covered with cow pies. The fence posts looked weathered and the wire was rusted. It was as though the house was never there, yet only about 2 months had passed. I've had a few other weird experiences in my life, but none like this, where reality seemed to shift. It still comes up from time to time when I see my old friends. It still weirds us out. I think I might have some pictures from the day we explored the house. I'll see if I can find them. Edit. I found the photos. Guys, we have a confirmed reality shift. Cynthia would be so proud. So, in the comments section, A couple people point out that an upside to this story and a plus for this story was that it was so specific. He was so specific about locations that you could track the entire journey on Google Maps, which is what we will do. So, when we pull up the map, we have Hillsville, Virginia, and we have Pilgrim's Trail here where he said his grandparents' cabin was. We have a cemetery right here. I don't see any graves from here, and also there's no street view on Pilgrim's Trail, unfortunately, otherwise I would. Oh, another cemetery. Alright, so this is the road you would get down to drive to Route 666. And here it is. It's called Collier School Road or something on this sign, but on the map you can see it is called Route 666. And there are a few houses dotted here and there. Another cemetery. And here is presumably the sharp bend that they talk about in the road. And there's the woods where they said the house would be. You don't see a house, but there is woods. Interestingly, though, in this clearing across from the bend, there is a house. It looks like a newer house. So, yeah, maybe that house on the map that we can see is the house that was in, disrepair when they visited and it was renovated. Although they do mention the house being tucked in the woods, right? Maybe they had cleared the woods on that side. Or maybe that house was, I don't know, maybe it was built. I'm not sure. So, interesting story. It does, seem to add validity that they included so many details where you could follow it on the map, but who knows? Well, that's all I have for you tonight. 11 stories and some change. I hope you had as much fun as I did. Vanishing houses and buildings are kind of difficult to pin down the legitimacy of, unless you are the person who experienced it, and sometimes even then. It's easy to say that a person just misremembered the area, or that perhaps a place was torn down. I remember taking a walk in a cemetery one rainy day, and I saw this old abandoned house tucked in the back of the cemetery. I wanted to check it out, but it was starting to rain harder, so I had to take my dog and leave. I went back not too long after with some friends, wanting to show them the place, and it was gone. I don't recall seeing any obvious signs of demolition, but I can't be sure. So, even though these kinds of stories can be difficult to validate, as is the case with all paranormal experiences, I guess, I still find them really intriguing and fun to consume, and hopefully you did too. So, I hope the rest of your night is mysterious and magical and just a little bit strange. And until next time.